I work for our grassroots coalition, Together Oklahoma, but we're not here for me this evening. We are here for everything about the budget you wanted to know, but were too afraid to ask. Our budget and tax senior policy analyst, Paul Shin, is joining us. He has a presentation for us this evening. A little bit about Paul. Paul joined OK Policy in May of 2019. He has held budget and finance positions for the Oklahoma House of Representatives, the Department of Human Services, the cities of Oklahoma City and Del City, several local governments in his native Oregon. He's also taught political science, public administration at the University of Oklahoma, University of Central Oklahoma, and California State University. While with the Government Finance Officers Association, Paul worked on consulting and research projects for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Department of Transportation, and several state agencies and local governments. He has served as a policy analyst at CAP Tulsa and holds a PhD in political science from the University of Oklahoma and degrees from the University of Oregon and the University of Maryland College Park. He lives in Oklahoma City with his wonderful wife, Carmelita. He is also my partner in all things fundraisers. When we have fundraising events together, we are the dynamic duo to see out and about. So with that, I'm going to turn over the evening to Paul Shin.
Thanks, Kyle. Is that screen sharing? Jessica, is my screen sharing? Kyle, anyone?
No, it's not.
You should be good to go.
Try it one more time. There you go.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Kyle, for the introduction. Thank you for being here, everybody. It's great that people are interested in the budget. I'm just going to say, you know, you heard my experience, and I'll say.
You should be good to go.
One more time.
Does that mean we're going back to the beginning? No, we're live. So you heard my experience. You should you should know from that it takes a special person to be interested in budget. I'm going to jump right in so that you have time to talk in groups, and we have lots of time for questions and answer. You know, how you get what comes out of a budget, what you're spending, how you're taxing, those are important as citizens. But for advocates, it's equally important to think about what we're doing when we budget, why a budget matters, and what the process is. And so I'll start by talking about how we get there, and then we'll move on to where we are. So budgets ultimately are moral documents, and they're ultimately ideological documents. When we do a budget, we're talking about what our values are. And those values are about what responsibility we share to each other versus what should be where we should leave people on their own. We talk about who should share the responsibility and in what proportion. And we also talk about what is most important, because a budget at the state is just like a budget at home. There's lots of stuff you'd like to do, but you can't do it all. And so you have to think about what matters most to you and then figure out how to do that. The thing that's weird is nobody ever discusses these things in such, you know, forthright terms as, oh, we're having a disagreement over morals. And so a lot goes on in the background that you have to infer from the discussion. First, I'm going to tell you how a budget process works generically, and then I'll tell you how we do it in a very special way in Oklahoma. So there's really kind of 6 steps in a budget process. First of all, you have to figure out, all things being equal, how much money are you going to have to spend? That is done at the Oklahoma Tax Commission and Office of Management and Enterprise Services in Oklahoma. Then you have to get together all of your needs. Now, state agencies do that. There are experts. You know, the folks at the Department of Human Services know what's necessary to serve people in poverty and to keep kids safe and to feed older people and things like that. And so the budget request is when they tell us, here's what you're going to need, and here's what we want to use it for. Then somebody has to take, it's just like at home, someone has to take all of those requests and make it equal the amount of money that's available. That's called the proposed budget or the executive budget. And in our state, the governor does that. The legislature, however, is constitutionally bound to actually establish the budget. That's called the adopted budget. Then those agencies go back and go to work, and the budget tells them what they can do, and it gives them amount they can spend. It also limits what they can spend. And then after the fact, audit, find out what was done, how the money was used. Not necessarily was it used wisely, but where did it all go, and were procedures followed? So in Oklahoma, revenue estimates are really hard because our revenue is volatile, meaning it jumps up and down a lot. That's because of our resource-based economy. A lot of our direct tax money comes from oil and gas, and a lot of other tax revenue depends on oil and gas. So it's tough. Revenue estimating is a tough job here. Then in Oklahoma, over the years, decisions have been made that a good chunk of the revenue isn't going to be part of the state budget. We don't budget federal money that comes in. That's about $7 billion a year. It's as much as what we call the state budget. And we don't budget a lot of tax revenue that goes directly to a particular purpose. You know, some of the oil and gas tax money goes straight to school districts. That never comes to the state, never shows up in the state budget. And then fees that agencies collect, health department, public safety agencies, and fines also don't show up on the budget. So when we talk about the budget in the state of Oklahoma, we're really only talking about a third of all the revenue that comes in. Everything else is, you know, apportioned by law automatically, and it isn't up to the legislature to decide what to do with it. We have a system where additional revenue is not typically on the table. That's because of an anti-tax culture. It's because we have a pretty conservative legislature and governor right now who don't want to see taxes go up. And it's because of State Question 640, which requires either a vote of the people or a legislative supermajority to approve a tax increase. So at home, if you have some needs with your current revenue that you just have to have, even though it's more than the amount of money you have, well, then you might look at going to get a second job or selling a car or something. Doesn't work that very, nobody at the state legislature has suggested the tax increase that's the equivalent of getting a second job, even though it's certainly possible. So budget requests, when those agencies ask for money, it's difficult in Oklahoma. Unlike a lot of states, we don't kind of have any overarching goals or priorities. We kind of have an unstated assumption that everything we've done this year is fine. Let's try to do more of it, but not too much more. And our process is very closed. While agencies have to submit a formal budget request in October for the year that starts the following July, it's really hard to get a hold of those, and they don't tell you very much. And what's bad about that is citizens don't have an opportunity to get a real feel for what we could be doing with our tax dollars. Many states, they publish all of the budget requests with a lot of detail, and they include them. They would show up in the governor's budget so that you would know, say, that the governor recommended a 5% cut for education, and they asked for a 9% increase, and here's what they would have done with that increase. So you can kind of, weigh the agency request versus the needs. And we usually don't even look at actual needs, what it would take to keep up with additional services to keep up with inflation, or what we should start doing that could really make a difference in our state. Because the agencies don't have the staff for that, they aren't directed to do that. Governor Stitt specifically limits how much they can request. This year he told them don't request more than 2% above what you got last year. And then the media, the governor, and the legislature all kind of deride agencies for asking for very much more. Then it's unrealistic. The question that I think should be asked more often is how realistic is it for us to merely continue what we've been doing? And I'll show the fruits of that later. So adopted budget, that's when, I skipped one. Adopted budget is when the legislature takes the governor's recommendation and makes the formal budget. That will be the authorization to spend and the limits on spending. Our deliberations are held in secret. The budget bill doesn't go through the regular legislative process. You know, if there's a bill to change anything, normally it's assigned to a committee in the House or Senate, and it's voted on in the Senate or House floor. Then it goes to the other side back through a committee process where you can get some idea of what's happening and who's behind it. Budget doesn't work that way. There are no formal or written records of amendments, so you can't say, the woman who represents me just put in an amendment for a $5,000 pay raise for teachers. I like that, I'm gonna support her. We have no idea who proposes what. There are no public hearings. Every state, virtually every state does most of those. Public hearings don't happen in every state. They do happen in probably half the states. New Mexico had 7 this year. And then there's never really a comprehensive budget that's created out of the whole thing. There's a handful of budget bills, and you really don't have a good idea of how the money's going to be used. So that's the process. To sum up the process, it's not very transparent, and it is bent to spend the same or less, not to spend more. And as a result, we're a low spending state. And we become much more over time. And most of the funds that we do have go to only a few high priority services. Let's go ahead and look at that in a little bit more detail. Low spending state. So Oklahoma here is in blue. The United States, the average US state, is in red. And this is looking at the total state and local government spending per person. So over at the left on the total, you can see our government spend about $8,800 per person per year. Average American state is 2,000 more than that. So we're about 25% behind the average state in what the amount we give to government. As you go across the services across the bottom, you can see that we are below average in education. We're further below average in health and social services. We're below average in public safety. We're below average in environment and housing. We're below average in utilities. We're below average in insurance trusts. That's things like unemployment, workers' comp, and employee retirement. And we're below average in every darn other thing too. The only place where we're barely above the average is in transportation. And that's because over the last 15 years or so, we've tried to address the backlog of road maintenance and failing bridges. So the point of this is Oklahoma is a low spending state. And over time, we're spending less and less. This is inflation adjusted and population growth adjusted, looking back at every budget so far this century. If you go back to the beginning, fiscal years 2000, which ended in the year 2000, our budget was $11.2 billion in today's budget. Now, if you go out to the end, you see that our budget is 7.7 billion. I'm sorry, I should have said 11.2 billion in today's dollars. Our budget now is 7.7 billion in today's dollars. And so we're about spending about a third less than we spent 20 years ago when you adjust for inflation and the fact that our population's growing. So just to stay even with where we were 20 years ago, we ought to be spending $3 to $4 billion more dollars. And then because we are not spending what we probably ought to, most of the money goes to just a handful of key services. Common Ed is 40%. The Healthcare Authority, which is Medicaid or Sooner Care, is 13%. So just those two items that take a bit over half of the budget. Higher Ed, the Department of Human Services and Corrections, you add those in, and that's over 3/4 of the budget. That's 7 agencies out of 63. So the other 56 agencies are trying to survive after dividing up just 1/4 of the budget. Now let's look at the other side, that shared responsibility taxation. And the important items to that are, first, taxes are falling over time. Second, taxes are regressive, and when we get to that slide, I'll describe a little bit more about what regressive means and what impacts it has. So this looks at total tax collections, state and local government, per $100 of personal income. So it's kind of like looking at ability to pay. If we were, somewhere that was Europe, you would probably see something like $60 per 100 personal income. In the United States, again, in red, you can see that back in the 90s, the US typical state spent roughly 10%, $10.32 out of every 100 of its income on state and local taxes. We were quite a bit below that, about $1 per 100. During the late 90s, as a result of House Bill 1017, which increased taxes to fund education, and some other targeted tax increases, we actually caught up with the nation as a whole within a few pennies. And then you can see that we really diverged and went on a different path than the rest of the country. It's important to remember to think about the rest of the country is exactly where it is now as compared to 2002. So the gap is that our leadership, supported by Oklahoma voters, made a decision to considerably shrink the size of government. And you can see that started in the early 2000s, income cuts under Governor Keating, further income tax cuts under Governor Henry, further income tax yet under Governor Fallin. And then at 2014 is the last of some tax cuts, as well as a hole in the budget because of oil. So at this point, our taxes are on average almost 20% less than the average state, just like our spending was less than the average state. Now this gets even more complicated. You know how we are about our graphs. This is looking from left to right, what share of taxes is paid by lowest income people and highest income people. So if you look over on the left, the lowest 20% of Oklahomans by income spend 13% of their total earnings on state and local taxes. So that's about $7 they spend on taxes. And those are people who make $17,000 per year or less. You move up into the second 20% in the 20s and 30,000s, they spend a little less as a share of their income, less and less and less. People in the top 20% are paying somewhere between 6 and 8%, considerably less. And if you go over to the top 1%, people about 400,000 or higher, they're paying less than half as a share of their income what someone at the lowest end is paying. That's called regressive taxes. And it's really an issue of justice, and you really have to question if it makes sense for the people who can least afford it to pay the biggest share for the shared responsibility of government. In Oklahoma, that's what we've chosen to do. Most state and local tax systems are somewhat regressive, but ours is close to the top. We are the 9th most regressive, or what sometimes is called vertically unjust tax system in the country. That concludes the presentation, so I wanted to leave you lots of time to discuss, and then be more than happy to come back and take questions.
Oh, thank you, Paul. Before we get over to questions, I'm going to wrap up our Facebook live stream, but I just wanted to say thank you so much, Paul, for that presentation. As always, you make tax and budget interesting and somewhat exciting as much as we can. And for those of you that are joining us live on the streams, we're going to go ahead and end the stream here momentarily. If you're interested in joining these chats that we're going to continue having after the live stream, go over to our Together Oklahoma Facebook page to find the Zoom registration. Go ahead and register, and you're welcome to join in on the conversation after the live stream has ended. But with that, we're going to go ahead and end. Jessica.